hot take, but I unironically love Star Wars. That's right, even the bad Star Wars. And that's exactly why I think that I'm probably the most qualified person when it comes to talking about this topic. That and Star Wars has treated me a lot better than a lot of my previous exes. And that's why today on Homebrew Heresy, I've decided to bring the Droid Army into Warhammer 40k. So if you're new, here's a brief overview of what we do around here. I take a faction or character from a pre-existing setting, and I try to transplant them into Warhammer 40k, taking all the key traits that makes them unique, and making them a part of the setting in Warhammer 40k. So, let's begin. In today's episode, like I mentioned in the intro, we'll be covering the Droid Army from Star Wars The Clone Wars, otherwise known as the CIS, or the Confederacy of Independent Systems. So, as we do around here, I think it's important that we cover the lore and origins of the faction known as the CIS, or the Droid Army. So the history of the Droid Army is actually a pretty uncomplicated one, as we actually see the first instance of this Droid Army in Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. During the Droid Army's invasion of Naboo, located in orbit above Naboo is a command post, this massive battle station in charge of controlling all of the robots on the planet's surface. The issue with this is that while I did give all the droids a universal sense of control and authority as well as a coordinated effort when it came to combat, it did have the issue of basically localizing all of the command posts into a single location, meaning that, for example, a small squadron could easily take out the command post, or in the case of Episode 1, we see a single child single-handedly destroy the entire command post, rendering the entire Droid Army in Naboo useless. As a result of this, however, the Trade Federation eventually adapted strategies and made all the droids under their control actually semi-independent, giving all of them a rudimentary sub-intelligence. Now, the reason why they chose to do this is pretty simple. It prevented them from localizing their control to a single command post that could easily be crippled by a single decapitation strike. However, there was a secondary benefit to this as well, as it gave each and every single one of the droids the ability to adapt on their own, as long as it was within their limited programming capabilities. This also allowed the droids to organize themselves into a far more complex status and ranking system. This also made it so that their more complex command structure made it more difficult for them to actually be destroyed. And it's one of the things that benefited them in the long run. This also made it possible for the CIS, or the Techno Union, who was a part of the CIS and the manufacturer of the droids overall, to actually create specialist units for particular instances and special occasions within the Droid Army. As now with a more complex command structure, they no longer had the rank and file infantry, but they could actually further diversify their command posts and units. This is one of the reasons why we see 3 separate instances of droidica across the Clone Wars TV show, as well as the further modifications of more droids, including the introduction of Vulture droids, who themselves possess a far more aggressive military intelligence. The origin of the CIS is actually a pretty hilarious one, at least in my opinion, because it's basically the Republic's fault that the CIS exists. To put into perspective, the Galactic Republic actually controlled the majority of the Star Wars galaxy. There are naturally going to be some systems or planets or even entire sectors that don't agree with the whole control the Republic has, along with a number of their bylaws and corruptive affairs in the Senate, shall we say. As a result of this, it was very common for a lot of systems, particularly those in the Outer Rim, to feel very separated and not connect to those within the core worlds. Not only that, but because of the sheer size of the Republic, it was very common for a single individual to have the say over countless worlds. And as a result, this can actually cause a lot of planets to not receive the proper funding or representation they needed in the Senate. Because of the growing tensions between the Republic and its member states, including those that had suffered under their oppression and corruption, it was very common for many of them to want to succeed. However, because of the sheer complexity of the Republic, they would have to fill out a form upon form upon form to just simply get the possibility of being able to succeed. And even then, the states within the Republic had to then vote on whether or not that planet or system would be permitted to leave, meaning that it wasn't uncommon for a single planet to put its fate in seceding from the Republic in the hands of millions of other people, all of whom don't even care about the future of that planet in general. And that was until a particular individual known as Count Dooku of Sereno, a former Jedi Master and skilled practitioner of Form 2, grew disillusioned with both the Republic and the Jedi Order, particularly after the death of his apprentice Qui-Gon Jinn. Dooku leaving the Order would create the actual political instability that would result in the formation of the CIS. Through the manipulation of Darth Sidious, otherwise known as Sheev Palpatine, corrupting and manipulating Count Dooku into a more willing participant of his plans, Dooku would begin to seek out a bunch of other planets and systems that had grown disillusioned with the Republic. And through the careful manipulations of Sidious, the politicking and charisma of Count Dooku, and the sheer greed of those within it, including the Techno Union and banker clans, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was formed. And so, with the formation of the Confederacy of Independent Systems fully put into motion, as well as a mass production of a droid army, the Clone Wars would officially begin. The main foundry was located on Geonosis, where the majority of the droid army was constructed, and this would also be the first battlefield of the Clone Wars. Here, the Jedi Masters, alongside their newly formed clone army, would begin the invasion of Geonosis. Eventually, they would achieve victory and actually force Count Dooku and the leaders of the Confederacy to flee. So, over the course of the 3 years, the droid army of the CIS actually causes mass amounts of damage across the galaxy, and waging countless wars against the clone army, Sidious created the droids for the singular purpose of wearing down the Jedi Order. As we see throughout the Clone Wars TV show, as well as the Star Wars micro-series, we can see that the Jedi are slowly whittled down to the point that they actually have to push for the promotion of more and more Jedi Knights. This literally tells us that the Jedi are being worn down so much over the course of this war that they have to send everyone to the front lines just to keep up. Now, rather than wasting your time talking about every single battle in the Clone Wars, as entertaining as that would be for me and you, I'm sure, I really am just going to skip to the very end of their lore quickly, wherein at the very end of the Clone Wars, we see that all the Confederacy's leaders are actually sent to Mustafar for safekeeping, wherein Anakin Skywalker, otherwise known as Darth Vader at this point, would slaughter all of them. It was upon their deaths and the completion of Order 66 that every single droid across the galaxy would be shut down, as we see in the Star Wars novelization of Revenge of the Sith. With their lore out of the way, let's get to covering their weapons and armor. The weapons and armor of the Confederacy of Independent Systems might be simple, but it's actually extremely effective. Beginning first with the standard infantry droid, these guys are basically cannon fodder. I like to call them the Roger droids, since that's a pretty funny name for them, but overall they lack no real benefit aside from mass numbers and, well, they're pretty funny, I guess. Next up, we have the assassin droids. Every single one of them is a highly skilled assassin able to do battle with a Jedi and actually in some cases defeat them. Though, in most cases, it typically requires 3 or 4 of them to actually defeat a Jedi. Then we have my favorite one, the Droidekas, otherwise known as the Destroyers or the Roly-Polies. The Droidekas are basically these massive wheels that can roll around before turning into stationary gun turrets with portable shields. These are some of the most effective and dangerous weapons in my opinion. And then even higher above them, at least in my personal opinion, is the Magna Guard. These guys have some of the coolest designs in Star Wars, and I really just love watching them run around. Unfortunately, they are predominantly used as bodyguards and have a pretty bad habit of basically being cannon fodder throughout the Clone Wars. Speaking of cannon fodder, we have General Grievous. Now, depending on your interpretation of the lore and how you're introduced to Grievous, he might be one of the coolest characters ever created, a smoking robot, or a coward. I like to view him as all three. Acting as the chief commander of the Droid Army, Grievous is a master combatant and commander. Predominantly, however, he relies mostly on his bionic upgrades to keep up with the Jedi and lead his forces. You see, Grievous began as a simple hunter-gatherer on a tribal planet, until a mistake left him decimated and his people dead. He would end up recovering and actually being trained by Count Dooku, and under the direct tutelage of Count Dooku, Grievous would actually master and hone the ability of lightsaber combat, but never become a Jedi or Force user himself. That being said though, with the tactics taught to him by Dooku, Grievous would become an extremely skilled Jedi hunter, going on to actually kill 5 Jedi in a single battle once. Now, alongside Grievous as the overall leaders of the Droid Army, we have the tactical droids and super tactical droids. Each one is a highly skilled combatant and master of war, able to analyze the battlefield, deduce combat strategies, and even create their own to counter the enemy. Now, I'm going to stop here when it comes to covering all the droids, as according to the wiki, there are over 106 battle droids used by the Confederacy, and most of them are either prototypes that never seen the light of day, are only ever used on a single battlefield, or very rare special occasions. Now, as for the methods of war of the Confederacy is a pretty interesting topic, as they seem to open combat with actually diplomacy, as strange as that sounds, and try to introduce a planet to the Confederacy peacefully and willingly. Unfortunately, if a planet cannot do that, it is very common for the planet to be blockaded by the Separatists before eventually imprisoning the population, as we see with the Twi'leks. They have a tendency to commit aggressively to combat and then immediately turtle up upon victory, fortifying a planet to defend against invasion. This is typically why the Outer Rim sieges happen, where a lot of the planets in the Outer Rim were so heavily fortified that it took an actual siege to take them down. And it's also why these battles were some of the most brutal and hard fought in the Clone Wars. And now we've covered the weapons, armor, and the methods of war used by the CIS and the Droid Army, we can actually begin by covering our goals. First, we're going to need a robotic army, which is going to be a little hard to go over when it comes to Warhammer 40k, given the strict adherence to the no AI policy that the Imperium prescribes. For our second goal, we're going to need an army of expendable soldiers, willingly throwing ourselves at the enemy to wear them down. Moreover, it also helps if our expendability does not come at an insane cost. In other words, cheap to replace is the name of the game. For our third and final goal, we're going to be nothing but mindless drones. Therefore, having a strong and commanding presence, whether that be in the form of an actual leader or a command station located somewhere else, is going to be necessary for us to function, meaning we're going to have to accommodate that when we're building this homebrew. Now then, onto the question of which of our 3 factions we're going to be using for this homebrew. Let's start by comparing our goals to the themes of the factions and see which one best fits with what we need. So before we cover which one I chose for this homebrew, let's take a look at some honorable creations. Starting off with Chaos, I could see the autonomous nature of the Thousand Suns Rubric Marines really fitting the goal when it comes to an army of robots. This combined with their ability to reanimate should they be destroyed also really fits well with the expendability goal we're looking for. Unfortunately, Thousand Suns as a faction also offer us psychic powers, which while a benefit in some cases also acts as a limiting factor for us, since the Droid Army are just that, droids, so they lack any ability to use psychic powers. That's why this build doesn't come any closer to just being an honorable mention, and why the Thousand Suns will not be what I choose when coming to build this homebrew. For our next honorable mention, we'll be looking at the Imperium of Man, more specifically the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Skitarii Legions. In lore, the Skitarii are lobotomized cyborgs, which wouldn't really fit with an army of robots we were looking for, but it's as close as we can get in terms of infantry and the Imperium of Man. Additionally, the Skitarii are fairly easy to replace in canon, with some actually even being clones of one another. Though there aren't very many rules to reflect this on the tabletop, which I'd argue is actually a point against this faction and one of the reasons why I will not be using them for this homebrew. The faction that I will be using for this homebrew is none other than the Necrons. I assume some of you already figured that out or already come to that same conclusion. But yes, I feel like the Necrons best fit what we're looking for. First, they're obviously an army of robots, which are not only expendable in terms of both their army size, but in their reanimation protocols, which ensures that even if they do fall, they can easily be brought back up to life if we roll properly. And of course, as Necrons, we are both obviously beholden to a Pharaon or an Overlord, both of which are incredibly powerful political figures in Necron society, as well as having total control over the general Necron populace under them. So, now we've got our faction out of the way, and which one we're going to be using for this homebrew, it's time for us to get started on writing our lore. The Dynastic Confederacy was an act of treachery committed by multiple minor Necron lords and pharaons in the opening years of the 41st millennium. Beginning first when a number of Necron lords chose to reject the Silent King's calls for aid, an act that would have normally resulted in their termination and any of the remaining forces and holdings being annexed into the greater empire. The current conflicts with the Stormlord have actually allowed these actions to go unpunished. As a result, it was normal for multiple other lesser dynasties also abandon their loyalty to both the Silent King and Stormlord, and lean to the formation of a third military force. While an impressive feat, most involved are well aware that should the civil war between the two sides come to an end, whoever wins will have the luxury of destroying them. And so, the Confederation of Necron dynasties works to perpetuate the war, ensuring for not only their own survival, as well as profiting off the remains of both conflicts. Led by the notorious and feared Necron Lord Grevious, the forces of the Confederation proved to be a formidable force to deal with. Aiming to demoralize their enemies during any conflict, all of the greatest generals and lords of the Confederation are known to sport treasures and trophies of their defeated foes into battle. The irradiated death world of Geonosis has become the unofficial capital of the Confederation, acting as a safe refuge for any Necron lords who wish to escape from the infighting. Though it isn't just the Necrons who are known to flee to Geonosis in order to escape the conflict, as many other lesser Xenos empires have actually found themselves joining the Confederacy, even if it means becoming second-class citizens to the Necron overlords. And there you have it, that's the lore behind our homebrew army. So with that out of the way, let's get to covering what you need in order to bring this lore to life on the tabletop. And as always, we're going to be aiming for a 500 point mark. So whenever I start these homebrew armies, I always like to look at the value boxes first and foremost, since I'd rather you guys try to buy a combat patrol or any other type of value box available before you guys start actually spending your money on the individual box sets. And luckily for us, since we're going for a 500 point mark, GW's Necron Combat Patrol is actually a very good starting point for this. Since at the time of this recording, GW's Necron Combat Patrol comes to around 445 points, which is a perfect starting point for an army, since all we're going to need to have to do is add a single enhancement to actually bring this army to a fairly close 500 point standard. On to the contents of the Combat Patrol. What comes in this box that we can actually use to create Grievous and the Droid Army in general? Starting off with our HQ, the Necron Combat Patrol comes with an Overlord, which is an excellent starting point since we can actually use this as a proxy for Grievous. Another thing that comes with the Overlord is actually its ability called Implacable Resilience, which actually allows us to subtract 1 from the damage characteristic whenever we are dealt damage, really reflecting his cybernetic augmentations and his overall insane resilience. As for the basic Necron warriors, these could easily be the Roger droids, and yes, I'm still calling them that because it's fucking hilarious, I don't care what you say. Their basic ability is their number is Legion, which allows us to actually reroll the dice we use when it comes to reanimating our units, which I think is another benefit to how we can actually reflect the massive number of troops the CIS used in combat over the course of the Clone Wars. The next unit that comes in this box set is probably one of my favorite Necron models overall, which is called the Scorpek Destroyers. Now, if we were to treat Grievous as a Scorpek Lord instead of an Overlord, this would be even more perfect. Unfortunately, that's not what we're going to be doing for this homebrew, since we're only bringing up what we can use in this box set. So the Scorpek Destroyers, I think, really fits really well with what could be used as the Magna Guards, which are his personal bodyguards that we see him use throughout the course of the Clone Wars, and help him destroy the Jedi. And like the Magna Guards, who are skilled master combatants when it comes to close quarters combat, the Scorpek Destroyers have the ability called Writhing Onslaught, which is an ability that allows them to reroll hit rolls of 1, or if they happen to be charging, which you can imagine the Magna Guards would be doing since they are actually leading the assault, they can actually reroll the entire hit roll instead, which I think is really indicative of what we see the Magna Guards do throughout the entire series of the Clone Wars. And for the big centerpiece model you get in this box set, you have the Canoptic Doomstalker, which is basically a massive tri-droid, really reflecting of what we see the CIS use throughout the Clone Wars. Additionally, another thing that really reflects what the tri-droids were they were stationary artillery pieces, which the Doomstalker is as well, since it comes with the ability Sentinel Construct, which is perfect when it comes to making your enemy reconsider if they actually want to lead a charge against you, since you could easily lay down a blast of covering fire from its Doomsday Blaster or Twin Gauss Flare weapons. Now, the only thing that I don't like in this box, and probably the thing that's probably going to give me the most hate, is I am not a fan of the Canoptic Scarab Swarms, since while they are an incredibly cute model, they offer us no lore benefit to using them in this army. The best I can say is there may be some sort of programmed weapon of some kind, but if I'm going to be totally honest, I would honestly just scrap the 3 little guys altogether and maybe try to buy something else. So altogether, like I mentioned before, this brings us to a total of around 445 points, though if you happen to get rid of the Scarab Swarms and easily want to buy something else, I highly suggest that. In terms of what detachment best fits the CIS and the Droid Army overall, I think that would actually be the Command Protocols of the Awakened Dynasty, which for those unaware, makes it so that if a Necron character is leading a unit, you can actually add a +1 to the hit roll, which to most people does not mean a lot and is actually a pretty useless ability overall. I find it to be really reflective of Grievous leading the droids to victory. And speaking of Grievous leading his droids to army, I would actually suggest use the Veil of Darkness enhancement on the Grievous model. It actually allows us to pull one of our Necron characters into reserve before allowing them to deep strike back onto the battlefield, which I think is really reflective of Grievous's combat against the Jedi and his new interpretations, shall we say, in Disney canon, being that he is often seen as a coward, often retreating from battle before coming back when victory is almost certain. So, as much as it kind of shits on Grievous's lore, this ability is kind of reflectant of him. And so with the models and rules out of the way, we've successfully built the CIS in 40k. Now, if you guys are unhappy with the particular rule set I chose when it came to building this Necron army in 40k, remember, when I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will make it a common thing that in every single one of my homebrews, I create a custom army rule for that homebrew. But because I'm nowhere near those subscriber total yet, you guys are going to have to stick with what GW's provided us. So if you guys want to see me do better than GW, make sure to support the channel and leave a like and subscribe. I hope you guys all have a good rest of your day. Bye!